Hello, I'm Bruce Lorincz, and this show is called Bruce on the Loose. I talk to people in the school system, city government, and county activities, and Carl Quatraro is with us today. He is a wealth of information. I really got to know Carl a little bit. He presented at Suprema Senior Center, and we're going to talk about the history of the Cleveland Indians and look back at their glory days and history. And Carl, how did you first get into speaking to various groups?
Well, I considered about 6 years ago, I was in the insurance industry, and I was considering what I was going to do with myself after I retired. And so one of the things I did in my job was to go to different employer groups and speak to them on different insurance topics. And so what I had to do is I used PowerPoint programs to do this, and I put those PowerPoint programs together, and I found that I really enjoyed doing this. And so I thought, after I retire, what I want to do is put together programs of topics that interest me, hopefully interest other people too. And so from that point, I started to put together programs, and now I'm up to over 20 different programs on different topics of things, again, I think are of general interest.
So not all just baseball, some other things. Can you describe a couple of the other programs?
Well, I have them, break them out into different categories. I do historical programs. I have two different programs on Titanic, for example, a topic I've been speaking about for now it seems 40 years, an incredibly long time. I also talked on a program on the Cuban Missile Crisis because that's something I remember in my youth. So I remember that happening, so I wanted to investigate that. So I do programs on history. I do programs on entertainment too, and so I'll have a series of programs on the making of different movies, such as in Christmas time I'll do It's a Wonderful Life and A Christmas Story, so I do those types of things as well. I do programs on space. I program on America's race to the moon in the 1960s, again, because that's something I remember happening. Also Apollo 13, because I remember that happening too. So programs like that. And then, of course, sports programs. I'll be doing a program here in October on the 1964 Cleveland Browns, because last time they won, so it's always a good thing to talk about that. Right. And this is also, I do a program on Rocky Colavito. This will be his 90th birthday coming up in August. And of course, I do a program on the history of Cleveland baseball.
I'm sure that gives you a lot of satisfaction in retelling our history, and I'm sure people really appreciate your presentations.
Well, I like to, when I do them, I always try to keep them entertaining. I like to keep things moving. I have a lot of animations, a lot of sound files, and I'm always changing them too. I never keep them the same. If I look at something, I think, oh, I think it needs this, or I think that's a little bit too slow, or I don't think I explained that very well. So I never do it the same way twice in a row.
When was the first game played in Cleveland for our baseball teams?
Well, of course, those kind of baseball was played well in the 1800s, mid 1800s. But the first professional game that I could identify was in 1869, when the Cleveland Red Stockings played a team up in Cleveland, just loosely called the Cleveland baseball team. And the Cleveland Red Stockings were a very good team back then, and they trounced our Cleveland team 25-6, but that was the first one there. In 1871, there was a second game, this now played by an organized Cleveland team against a Fort Wayne team. So 1869 would be the first time an organized professional type game was played in the Cleveland area.
In the late 1800s, what were some of the teams and leagues that Cleveland was associated with?
That was an era where there were a lot of different leagues. And so, for example, the very first league was it's called the National Professional League of Baseball Players, and then that later became the National League. And then there was also the Union Association, there was the American Association, there was a Players League. So there were a lot of leagues that came and went. Sometimes they'd last for 1 year, sometimes they would last for a couple of years, but a lot of those teams came and went pretty quickly. The Cleveland Blues as a name seemed to last for quite a while, though. They had a lot of different teams called the Cleveland Blues.
So the initial professional baseball game was played in Cleveland in what year?
Well, I'll still go back to 1869
Okay,
on that.
all right.
That would be the first professional played by people who were being paid money to play baseball, as opposed to just amateurs.
Where did the Cleveland Spiders play their home contests?
Cleveland Spiders, they had a kind of an interesting story how they came to be to begin with. They were The original team was part of the American Association, and there was an expansion team for that particular league for 2 years. And then they eventually, after 2 years, they moved over to the National League in 1889, and that's when they became the Cleveland Spiders. Now they played their initial games in downtown Cleveland, but then they moved to League Park, one of the very first league parks. That was first game there was in 1891. That was at East 66 in Lexington. Now that league park was not the same league park that came in later. This was a smaller league park that you see on the screen there. That was a single deck affair, about 9,000 seats, a wooden construction, about the same size as we see in downtown Akron with Canal Place. So, or Canal Park, I should say. So it's about a smaller, almost a minor league size park at that time. That's where the original Cleveland Spiders played their games.
Is League Park still around today?
Well, that particular league park that you saw on the screen is not around, and what happened was that in 1909, the old league park was torn down because it was too small. It was rebuilt in 1910, and that's the picture you see on the screen now. It was around until the late 1940s, early 1950s, but part of that league park still remains today. Not much, but some of it does. There is a window. There is a picture of it. That's the city of Cleveland decided they were going to rebuild this into a historic center, and that's what it's doing right now. Very interesting place to go to. It's still there, East 66 in Lexington. You can go there and visit it. It's got some interesting artifacts inside to go check out, but there's the ticket building there is still there, and one section of one wall is still there, but the grandstands are gone. But they still play baseball games there, which is great. You know, it's still pretty much the same dimensions as the old league park. If you want to go see or the city will have some baseball games there, so it's still being used for baseball, which is great.
And some of those older parks, really the distance. We think of today, clubs keep moving in the fences, but boy, they were really out there. If you hit a home run, it was quite a feat. It
had a center field of 460 feet, and those fences weren't moving. They were stuck there. But on the right field was only 290 feet because, again, they had to build it within a neighborhood. And so they had an odd dimension. So it was very short in right field, but very long in center field because of that. So it was a quirky field, but they had a lot of those type of fields back then. Right.
Reminds me a little bit of Fenway Park. I went to a game and I sat right next to Pesky's pole. Yeah, and it was very, very short, and then it jutted out really quickly to right center.
That's why they've got the green monster is the way it is, because again they ran out of space, so they had to build a gigantic wall there to keep the ball in.
Right. How did the Cleveland Spiders get its original name?
Well, it's one of those things that's kind of lost to legend exactly what happened, but one of the stories was that a sports writer saw the team on the field in their black and white uniforms, and he saw them as being kind of gangly looking, and so he said they looked like a bunch of spiders out there. And so this is part of what they did back in that era. The sports writers used a lot of colorful imagery to paint the pictures, and so that's one of the stories of how they got their name, the Spiders.
Were the Spiders a competitive team?
They were a surprisingly good team. They played for the National League Championship 3 different times. They won 1 time. Their first attempt to win was in 1892 in what was then called the World Series. They played at that time they played the Boston Bean Eaters of the National League. They had the first half winner play the second half winner, and Cleveland was the second half winner, and they lost to Boston 5 games to none. So they didn't do too well in 1892, but the National League changed the format a few years later, and then they played for what they called the Temple Cup. And so the Cleveland Spiders then played the Baltimore Orioles, not the same Baltimore Orioles of today, but they played them for the Temple Cup in 1895, and this time it was the first place versus the second place team, so they changed the format. And the Cleveland Spiders won. They won 4 games to 1 in 1895. Next year in 1896, it was a rematch. The Baltimore Orioles again played the Cleveland Spiders. This time, Baltimore Orioles beat them 4 games to none. So they did play for the National League title 3 out of 6 years, winning 1 time. So overall, they had For the first 10 years, they had a good run. They had seven winning seasons. They had 3 losing seasons until the 1899 season.
Who are some of the top players for the Spiders?
Well, the top player of the Spiders is going to be Cy Young. Cy Young was a local product.
Yeah.
There's a picture of him.
I think he was from Ohio, southern Ohio, wasn't he?
He came from Tuscarawas County, the Newcomerstown area.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And so he was a local product, and his name was Denton True Young. That was his real name. He got the name Cy because the players said he was from the country, so they called him Cyrus. But then they later nicknamed the nickname Cy stood for Cyclone because of the fact that he threw so hard and so well. So he was a very good player. Here's a picture of his tomb. He's buried in New Pioli Cemetery, which is about 30 miles south of New Philadelphia. So it's quite a ways out there, but you can even see in that picture some people have set up. They'll bring baseballs and hats and so forth and leave them there on the tombstone. But it's an interesting place to go to. It is out in the middle of the country, though. But it's sitting right there. So, but he was passed away in 1955, and then it's still kind of there's apparently some kind of a museum over in Newcomerstown too about him too.
He must have been quite the athlete because they named the top pitcher in first. I guess it was just one overall winner, and then they made it to American and National League winners.
He won 511 games in his career, and that's almost 100 more than second place as far as a pitcher goes. Right. So he was by far the best pitcher of his day, and he many times won 30 games in 1 year. Yeah. So not just one time, but many times. So he was a dominant pitcher. He played for Cleveland, he played for Boston, and then we'll see that he came back to Cleveland too.
So back then, the pitchers, after 6 innings, they didn't bring the relief pitcher in, did they, Carl? Or did they go that? And even I remember some other books I read that some of the starters would even, with a couple days rest, come in to relieve.
They pitched a lot back then. They were tough back then. They really played a lot. They didn't have the specialty pitchers, and so they would play a lot and pitch a lot. And so I don't know how many innings he pitched, but he definitely worked hard in his time.
Whatever happened to the Spiders? Well,
I mentioned 1899. Now, what happened was that the Cleveland Spiders were owned by the Brobison brothers, who were allowed to own 2 different teams in the National League at the same time.
Wow.
So what they did is they took the good players from the Cleveland team and they sent them to their St. Louis team. The idea was to try to build up one really good team, and they took their not so good players from St. Louis and moved them to the Cleveland team. And the result was a mediocre St. Louis team and a horrible Cleveland team. Horrible Cleveland
So
team.
their plans didn't work out very well.
No, not too well. They ended up 20-136. They won 20 games and lost 136 games. And the record is even worse. They were worse than the record, as incredible as that is. They ended up losing 40 of their last 41 games. They only won the only game they won was by 1 run. They were that terrible, and so much so that they would average about 150 attendees at a game. And the National League teams did not want to come to Cleveland because they knew they weren't going to get the gate to help pay for their expenses. And so the Cleveland team ended up playing almost all of their remaining games on the road. And so that contributed to their horrible season. So after that, the Spiders, the National League decided to consolidate from 12 teams down to 8, and the Cleveland Spiders are one of the 4 teams that were eliminated. So after the 1899 season, the Cleveland Spiders were no more.
So did then the Spiders, did they transition? Did they become the Cleveland Indians after that?
Well, another total different story on that. That the Spiders were a National League team. They did not become the Indians, the Guardians that we know today. Their story begins in 1894 when they were a team in what was called the Western League. They were in Grand Rapids at the time. The Grand Rapids Wrestlers, sometimes they were called the Rippers. But they played in the Western League, which was a minor league. In 1899, after the Cleveland left and was no more, they decided to move from Grand Rapids to Cleveland and relocated in Cleveland, and at that point changed their name to the Cleveland Lakeshores. And so they were still in part of what was then still the minor league Western League at that time. Well, in 1900, the Western League became the American League, still a minor league, and then the team became known as the Cleveland Blues. Then in 1901, the American League became a major league in direct competition with the National League. And so that's the team that we have today.
Okay, what were some of the best players then on the transitional team? Did they get experience and get better, or did they acquire some new players?
Well, the big thing that happened for this team that made them the big break was they went from, in 1901 they were the Blues, 1902 they became the Broncos, but in 1902, because of a contract dispute in the American and National Leagues, a player named Napoleon Lajoie was able to jump over to Cleveland. He was acquired by Cleveland, and so he was a premier player in all of baseball, and so he went from the Athletics, the Philadelphia Athletics, over to Cleveland. So he was by far the top player of the team at that time. He became their manager for a few years too, but he was definitely one of the elite players of the American League.
In what position did he play?
He was second base.
Second baseman, and he was a little bit. He was tall, slender, and what a hitter he was.
He was a phenomenal hitter. He ended up with a .339 lifetime batting average. So a phenomenal player in all regards, Napoleon Lajoie. Then they also had some other players too. They had Adrian Joss was his name. He was a player, a pitcher. Phenomenal pitcher. He had a perfect game in 1908. In 1908, the team that almost went to the World Series. They were. I think I skipped over the fact they were renamed the Naps at this point. After Napoleon Lajoie, they changed their name in 1903 to the Naps. The Naps almost went to the World Series in 1908, missed by half a game, lost out to the Detroit Tigers. They didn't make up games at that point. If you got rained out, you just didn't make them up, and so that's why they lost out.
That could really be a disadvantage for a team, especially a lot of those races were very thinly decided.
You never know if they would have played that one extra game, what would have happened, but they didn't. But Addy Joss ended up acquiring meningitis and dying in 1910. There was a benefit game for him in 1911 that ended up being the first All-Star game. It was held in League Park. And the players from the National and American League got together to benefit the Joss family in 1911, so that was awful good of them to do such a thing. Another big player for that team was Elmer Flick, the pride of Bedford, Ohio. Elmer Flick was also a very good player for them, and he also came over in the same situation with Philadelphia. And so he played for them. In fact, he was almost traded for Ty Cobb in 1907. The Detroit Tigers wanted to trade their surly Ty Cobb to the Naps for this very solid player in Elmer Flick, and the deal that was never made. And Elmer Flick only played for a few more years before he retired.
Yeah, Ty Cobb was quite a character. The lore has it that he didn't mind spiking all the infielders when he was trying to steal second or third base.
He was a very surly player,
yes.
And Detroit had their fill of him at that time, and that's when they wanted to get rid of him. But then they thought better of it, so they kept him. And of course, they never won a World Series with him, but he was a very good player, as we all know.
Nicknames were very, very prominent during this era, and I think Ty Cobb was called the Georgia Peach. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. He came from Georgia, and he had his own attitudes when he came up north, and again, not the best teammate. We'll put it that way.
What about whatever happened to Napoleon Lajoie?
Well, Napoleon Lajoie was, as all happens with our baseball players, as they get older, time moves on, and so is the team decided that rather than pay him his $9,000 a year salary, which was about $275,000 in today's money, that they were going to move him back to Philadelphia, and so he finished up his career in Philadelphia Athletics in 1915 and 16. But at the end of the 1914 season, the team had a dilemma, because now that didn't have Napoleon Lajoie on the team anymore, how could they call themselves the Cleveland Naps? So it was at this time that the ownership of the team decided to work with the local Cleveland papers, the Plain Dealer, the Press, and the News, to have the fans send in their suggestions for a new name for the team. And that's what started off the name that ended up becoming the Indians.
That's quite a unique situation. Now we have just the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Then there were 3 prominent papers in Cleveland, and then that's not saying Akron and the surrounding community. So baseball really got a lot of coverage from the local papers, didn't they?
They did, and they were all competing with themselves to try to outdo the other one for coverage, and so that's why I was mentioning before how they would use a lot of colorful language and colorful expressions and so forth, which kind of goes into how the Indians got their name. And that was because back in the 1800s, late 1800s, the Spiders had a player named Louis Sockalexis. Louis Sockalexis was, there's a picture of him, he was a full-blooded Native American. He was from the Penobscot tribe of Maine, so he was a true American Indian. And he played on the team for 3 years, 1897, first half of 1897, also 1898, and a little bit of 1899. But he had a very good half season for 1897, and the sports writers, again, picking up on the fact that he was an American Indian, would sometimes call the team the chief and his Indians. And so when it came time to change the name of the team, the sports writers thought back 15 years prior and said, why don't we just rename the team the Indians because of what they called them back in the papers back then. And that's all. There wasn't a whole lot of thought behind it. Other than that, they just thought that the Indians clicked because of the connection 15 years prior.
You talked about some of the competitive teams that Cleveland had in the late 1800s and early 1900s. How did the community support the team, and did they really back the club all the way?
Well, I can speak for, at least in the early 1900s, that the communities all really clamored around the Indians or the Naps at that time, that they really supported those teams. Of course, like anything else, when the teams were bad, they didn't support them. They would, but when they were good, the people really came out and really supported those teams, and that's, we kind of assumed that would be the case, but they didn't have a lot of spare money back then either. But they found a way to support their baseball teams and get up to see the games. And
of course, a lot of innovations weren't in baseball. Lights came, believe it or not, several decades later. And so when were the games played?
Well, they were going to be played in the daytime. The league park never did get lights. He never ever did get lights, and so they would have to play these daytime games. And so you can imagine, you've got workers working during the day, and yet these ball games being played during the day. You think, well, how do people get to the games? So other than the weekends, and of course back then they might be working all weekend too. So I find it amazing that they had enough support that they did, that realizing that they didn't have a lot of expendable income to begin with, they didn't have a lot of extra time to begin with, and yet they still supported all of these teams.
And you have a uniform on. What year would that be? But the older uniforms were wool, and you talk about Day being 90 plus. I mean, I'm sure it really was very difficult for the players.
Yeah, this jersey I have on it's a replica 1948 road uniform.
We'll get to that later, but
that's what this one is. And I see on your tie you've got some old players there too, which is kind of interesting too. But they played in wool uniforms, and they probably to last was one of the reasons behind it, because those kind of uniforms were meant to last for the whole season and then some. So it was not a real comfortable thing for those guys, I'm sure, to be playing in some of those conditions.
And we also need to point out about some of the equipment. And maybe you can help me out. The players, when the inning was over, they would drop their gloves and run to their dugout. Why would they do that?
I don't have a great answer to why they would do that, because it would seem like it would be better to take them in with them, because they could be sitting out there, they could be getting wet, they could be getting stepped on, but I don't have a great answer.
I think sometimes the other team, if they were right-handed, they would go ahead and use that glove. I read somewhere along the way, but I thought that maybe there was a shortage of gloves around, and they just didn't have many.
It's one of those quirky things about baseball, that they would do funny things like that. So that doesn't surprise me they would do that.
And now we go out of our way to make sure that players are safe. We make sure that, of course, the outfield, as you mentioned about some of the long distance drives that the outfielders would run into, it's really a different situation where the players are really helped out a lot by a lot of medical people.
Yeah, back then you just played. You know, it doesn't. If you were hurt, you played. It didn't matter. If you were sick, you played, and you were expected to play regardless of anything.
No question about it. What about some of the situations with other communities? What about, like you said, Baltimore? Did they go ahead and have some of the same changes and name changes like Cleveland?
Back in the early years, teams changed their names a lot. It's just remarkable. I think of the Brooklyn Dodgers, who had all types of different name changes. They were sometimes called the Robins, sometimes they were called the Dodgers, sometimes they were called the Trolley Dodgers, and those nicknames flipped around a lot. And
even the Yankees were the Gothams, I think, for a while, and some other
Highlanders,
names.
They were Highlanders, and so again, it's not uncommon to have these names change quite a bit. Boston went through a lot of different names as well. They weren't always the Red Sox. They were the Americans. They were the Pilgrims. So it just depended on what they felt like that particular year.
Sometimes hard to follow because Boston had two teams for a while. Then they, I think it was the Braves, moved to Milwaukee.
Yes, they did.
And it was really hard to keep a handle. And the fans, especially in New York, were very upset when the two New York teams moved to the West Coast.
Yes, they did. So, yeah, sometimes the teams in the early teams, they would be called the Clevelands, or they'd just be called the New Yorks or the Chicagos or things like this. They wouldn't even be identified by a nickname.
Carl, enjoyed our conversation today. We have two more coming up. We're going to look at the Cleveland Club from maybe right before this World War I to their glory year in the late 40s, and then we're going to do another one, the kind of the modern Cleveland Club. So really learned a lot today, and I hope our viewers learned as much as I did. Thank you for viewing Bruce on the Loose, and we'll be back in a couple weeks. Next week we're going to try to get the groundskeeper for the Wadsworth City Schools. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for having me.
We were right on the money too, I tell you.
You are watching WCTV, Wadsworth Community Television.